About SGM. Yeah, but it doesn't actually specifically say.
I wouldn't talk during this. I don't know if people can hear.
Welcome, everyone, whether you're joining us from YouTube, X, or Facebook. My name's Jordan Ditloff. Those of you who are here probably know who I am. You may also be joining by virtue of my guest today, and I suppose my co-debate participant, Chris Robertson, also known as Caffeine and Philosophy from the glorious US of A, joining us from the past on Sunday, 7 p.m. Pacific time, while here in Victoria, Australia, I think it's fair to say San Francisco-esque heartland of the woke mind virus in Australia, regrettably. It's midday on a Monday. Now, we'll be recording this in addition to it going live, and both of us will be clipping and putting up on our stories and stuff, anything of interest that arises over the next couple of hours. I hope that you will enjoy and get something out of our discussion. We're going to be having a pretty informal conversation about libertarian philosophy and some of the controversies or areas, I suppose, that might mark the limits or edges of libertarian philosophy, where things start to get a little bit grey or a little bit maybe controversial. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Chris. Actually, we've had a bit of a chat before this about each of our journeys and who we are and where we come to this from. But you sort of indicated to me that you once would have described yourself possibly as a libertarian. I'd argue that the most libertarian thing anyone can do is find problems with libertarianism, and any gathering of people with libertarian ideas is just always a great time and filled with arguments and accusations of statism and so forth. So feel that in my soul. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey, I guess, and what brought you to put out more or less an open invitation to debate libertarian philosophy in 2025.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was a default liberal, we could say, up until about 2012. And then
so in the American context, that means you would have voted.
I would have been a Democrat, basically.
Democrat, yeah.
Not a strong Democrat, just a like, oh yeah, obviously that's the cooler choice kind of thing. And then in 2012, I discovered, sort of by accident, a character named Douglas Murray, who had written a book. He wasn't as famous then as he is now, and I'm actually not as much of a fan of him anymore. But I read a book of his called Neoconservatism, Why We Need It. Now, at the time, as a 22-year-old, I didn't understand the difference between conservatism and neoconservatism. I didn't know the history of neoconservatism at the time, but it introduced me to some nominally conservative arguments that were quite serious that I'd never heard before, that no one seemed to have a good answer for.
Like Reagan and Thatcher and that kind of thing? Is that what they would have called neoconservatism? Or
neoconservatism is sort of difficult to describe. It basically blends Trotskyist thinking and Trotskyist internationalism with sort of Enlightenment liberal ideals in many ways. There isn't a huge gap between what people call neoconservatism and what some people would call neoliberalism. Maybe the most famous advocate of this would be Francis Fukuyama.
Yes, end of history.
Right. That he would be he would be very adjacent to this. And many people in the George Bush administration were open neoconservatives in the philosophical sense. It's not the same thing as conservatism.
So it was almost like a proselytizing kind of brand of like, eventually the Western values of conservatism will sort of reign triumphant.
Yeah, it's a sort of manifest destiny of liberal democracy, we could say. Mm-hmm. And this will be the end of history. Then we'll have nothing else will happen. It'll just be a good time. We'll all be first world countries with lots of oil and technology and that kind of thing.
It'll be turtles all the way down, as they might have said.
Right. And so that sort of opened my mind to alternatives to the very sort of default center-left view that I grew up in. And then a friend introduced me, as is the case to many people, like a kind of gateway drug, to the writings of a gentleman named Thomas Sowell. Perhaps you've heard of him.
Yes, yes.
So I read quite a bit of Thomas Sowell, and eventually a little bit of Hayek. And it was to the point that I actually voted for Gary Johnson when he was running for office back in, gosh, what would this have been?
That would have been was that 2016?
It was 2012. I'm getting my years off. I must have been introduced to Murray earlier than I thought. But yeah, I was supporting Gary Johnson for president. I believe back in 2012, because I was just barely not old enough to vote in 2008 when I absolutely would have voted for Obama. And then I learned some things. So I was not just a libertarian, but a fairly strong libertarian, and would have described myself as a libertarian to anybody who asked me. You know, I'd read The Fountainhead, I'd read Atlas Shrugged.
Probably to a good number of people who hadn't asked you.
Yeah, vegans, libertarians, kind of.
There is a Venn diagram, regrettably, yes. Libertarians are the vegans.
Is theft. Have you heard that taxation is theft? Yeah.
Have you heard about it? Maybe Murray Rothbard.
Right. So, I there's probably no one on YouTube. He's not on YouTube anymore until recently, but there had been no one on YouTube I had listened to more than Stefan Molyneux. So I was like very deep into the like the libertarian soup, as it were. And it doesn't mean I've read every one. I've heard a fair bit about Hans Hermann Hoppe. I've not read him. I am familiar with Murray Rothbard's arguments. I haven't read him. But I like the framing of this argument because usually the burden is on the affirmative to make the case, and then the negation gets to respond. So the idea that we're both coming in as libertarians, and maybe the negation of libertarian requires the burden of proof, is a fun inversion there, because I feel like I've been deconverted. And if I had to name a name of like the person or people who deconverted me, it was sort of a 1-2 punch. Because one book I read many years ago was a book by a gentleman, perhaps you've heard of this guy too, named Ludwig von Mises, called Human Action. And what
that was his von Mises 49, I think, wasn't it?
Something like that. It was a ways back.
Yeah,
what he advances in Human Action is an argument called praxeology. Let me back up for a second. There are essentially 3 arguments that you can make for libertarianism. You can make a sort of economic argument, as Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, to a degree, Hayek, Chicago school economists tend to make. Austrian kind of too. You can make that's economic arguments. You can make a moral argument, as Bastiat, or my understanding of Murray Rothbard, are kind of in the moral category.
Rothbard is like very natural Aristotelian. Yeah.
Right. And third of all, you can make a philosophical argument. And that's what von Mises is doing, and that's what Ayn Rand is trying to do. With the economic argument, they say libertarianism creates the best outcomes. The moral argument says, no, it's a moral imperative to be libertarian, to accept the non-aggression principle and all this. And the philosophical arguments are basically, it is man's nature basically to be free, and this is like aligned with what it is to be human in some way, and all this government imposition is the corruption of lower parts of our nature over the higher things of that nature. I think the economic arguments are the most dubious. And economic arguments in general are dubious, no matter what direction you're arguing, because the use of numbers in economics is very
lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's like
it's the very subjective. It's not the dismal science. It's kind of the BS science. No one knows what they're talking about with economics. That said, there are some very strong arguments against international free trade, and there's a really great book, a debate book called "On the Question of Free Trade," and it's co-written by Vox Day and a Chicago school economist named Dr. Woods, if I remember correctly. And Vox Day, in my opinion, just wins fairly cleanly on that. There's a problem where international free trade necessarily induces international labor mobility that was not accounted for when the original arguments for free trade were being made back in the day. So there were some variables that weren't taken into account that erodes national sovereignty, that erodes social cohesion, and ultimately even erodes the economic viability of these countries in the long term. So I do recommend people check out that book if the economic arguments are the ones that are interesting to them. I don't think that's the case for most people.
I'm interested, just before you continue.
Sure.
Is their argument simply that international free trade shouldn't exist in the sense envisaged by like traditional arguments for it, or do they say that the effective or the alternative is like a America first kind of tariff oriented position similar to what Trump's enacting? What's their actual alternative position?
Not like what Trump's doing, unfortunately, because what it looks like Trump's doing is less of an economic policy and more of just a short-term negotiation tactic. But yes, the argument would be for something more like national protectionism to protect industries, first and foremost for national security, which plays a role in the economic welfare of these countries. But also, it's been a while since I've read it. The national sovereignty argument was like enough for me. I was like, oh, okay, there's a really strong argument here that Professor Woods was not really able to address, other than sort of vague hand waving to abstractions. But there's actually long-term economic deleterious effects to international free trade that Vox Day brings up. So again, I don't think most people become libertarians based on economic arguments. I think the people
which is kind of ironic in a sense, because that's one of the things that the opponents of libertarianism probably most identify the idea with. But you're right, I agree. I think that's typically not the gateway for most people.
Right. They accept it based on the moral or philosophical arguments, usually the moral arguments, and then it's like, oh, here are some economic arguments that support my feelings about authority, government, the state, theft, so forth. So I think the economic arguments are dubious. The moral arguments that Bastiat and Rothbard make, and which others make, hinge upon notions of individuality and ownership that are actually very difficult to defend if you are not a Christian. And I am not a Christian.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So I was wondering, like, we had a bit of a chat over the last couple of days before this, and I told you I intentionally sort of wanted to hear your critique or your, issues with the moral justifications, like, on stream. Like, I didn't want to necessarily have heard it beforehand, but that is an interesting one. And I'm not a person of faith either, but I agree that I think Western secular civilization, to the extent that it has internalized elements of Christianity, is still kind of compatible, even if you're not a person of faith. If you have that, just because Western civilization is almost like an incubation or a sort of like an inheritor of a lot of Christian values and ideology historically.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, Christianity picked up and ran with some stuff that preceded Christianity too.
Yes.
But yes, there are. I mean, what we have in many religions like Christianity is there's a pattern of behaviors that happen in functional societies, and we can describe them as like respect for individual dignity or something like that. But in the process of describing the pattern, we sometimes fall into this danger of creating a concrete rule that, if taken literally, sort of breaks the complexity of everything else by becoming something solid, when the reality of these functional societies is that they were juggling multiple different values against each other and finding good negotiated middles, finding balances between multiple ideals. Are you familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt by any chance?
I have not yet.
He's a moral psychologist out of, I forget which university. He's an American psychologist who was originally a liberal and sort of became a libertarian. But he does these, he has basically a 5-factor analysis for what do people care about morally. Liberals care about 2 things. They care about harm and they care about fairness. Conservatives care about harm and fairness, but they also care about tradition, and they care about, was it disgust or something? Purity. Tradition, purity, and also liberty.
I think fairness has to be unpacked a little bit, because the way in which the right talk about fairness and the left talk about fairness is different.
So all of these words need to be unpacked.
yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that sometimes you fall into these really unhelpful definitional debates, and I'm kind of excited at this format because it's going to be a really good conversation without that really frustrating thing that happens when people are just talking around each other in circles and can't really agree on the terms of the frame. Like, I can tell that's not going to happen, but like conversations I've had with pretty smart people on the left, and even like the socialist Leninist left, like run into that problem that they consider fairness to be equality of outcome, whereas the right, the libertarian / conservative right, would consider fairness to be equality of opportunity, or at the very least equality of systematic opportunity. Like, you're going to start from different places, but it should be possible to move through a system in a way that is fair. The rules of the game are fair rather than the outcome of the game is fair.
Right. And academics will sometimes, the good ones, will try to distinguish those two by saying one is like equality of outcome is equity, equality of opportunity is equality. But there are leftist arguments for why those two are not so far apart. If you assume that everything is environmental, then all outcomes are not the results of merit anyways, because they essentially don't believe in that. So anyways, a rabbit hole for another time. But the point is that conservatives believe in all 5 of these things. They do value equality, and they value harm, but they also value purity, and they value, tradition and liberty. Libertarians only value 1. Guess which one that is? That's according to Haidt's research. Now, what's interesting about Haidt is, after doing all this research, he sort of became a libertarian. I have sort of gone the other way in looking into this. I was like, oh, there are other things that matter. Neglecting more of them doesn't seem like the answer.
And I think that's going to be really interesting. That's something I'm keen to chat about, because I wanted to kind of get into this fairly early, and this seems like kind of an appropriate juncture, is what libertarianism isn't or doesn't try to be. And I think that's important as well, because I think that in people's search for, their political home or how they would kind of define themselves or whatever, I think that libertarianism has an appeal when you're kind of, I guess, a young person. I'm going to say a young man, because like a lot of libertarians are men, not all libertarians, but like when you're a young person, like searching for something that gives you a sense of identity, it's easy for that thing you find to kind of become your identity, and to be like, to try to make the thing you found that you think describes you do all things or be all things. And like one, I really like Dave Smith in the US in the way that he explicitly addresses this, and he says like libertarianism, and Jeremy Kaufman actually is always like way spicier. I don't know if you follow Jeremy Kaufman at all. He's not on Insta. He's more of an X kind of personality, but and therefore just super, like controversial. He just says extremely controversial shit for the sake of it, I think. But both of those guys,
many such cases.
Yeah, many such cases. Yeah, both of those guys talk about how libertarianism basically is a set of minimum rules of engagement or parameters that kind of carve out a canvas upon which people can paint many different things within the context of libertarianism. But like the people who think or want libertarianism to furnish the answers to the why or the moral character of someone who is a libertarian in its own right without more, that to me, from what I've experienced both in my own journey and from people I've spoken with or met who have kind of, come into orbit of libertarianism and then drifted away from it, I think that often it seems to stem from that feeling of almost like having eaten but still being hungry. Does that resonate with you? Is that sort of something that you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking to politics in general for some kind of spiritual fulfillment, unless you're a Marxist, you're not going to, or a fascist, you're not going to find that there. That's not, or the exceptions keep coming to my mind. A certain kind of Muslim imperialist, a certain kind of ecology green activist. I suppose there are some people who find spiritual fulfillment, but for the larger parties, we'll say, of Democrats in the United States, Republicans, socialists, and labor parties, even, there is a moral sense of righteousness there, but it's still a means to an end. It's not the end itself. The end is still something you have to do. So the question becomes, well, which of these political philosophical systems is going to set us up the best to pursue what it is we care about? And not all of these political ideologies are equally amenable to all ideals, obviously. But when one of my favorite political questions to ask people, if I don't know where, how else to begin, or if there's a large gap, is, suppose you got everything you wanted politically. Suppose you got everything, all the policies you want, everything. What would you do then? Like what kind of life would you live in the political utopia has been established? And what's fun about that question is, almost without exception, no matter what people say in response to that, 95% of it is achievable without any political change at all.
Yes.
You don't need to change, but that goes for libertarians too. Most of what we want to do is achievable here. It might be cheaper in some alternative world, and what people focus on reducing the price of most, that if you're a leftist, it's about reducing price of housing and price of healthcare. If you are a right winger, it's more reducing the cost of goods, and maybe the cost of raising kids. Libertarians, let's reduce the cost of everything, reduce taxes,
and including and probably including reducing barriers or exceptions to property rights and other things like that. I think it's interesting, just quickly picking up on that. I think that for many, so here in Australia with the federal election I contested, the result was an overwhelming Labor, which is our sort of Democrat equivalent, victory, like crushing victory. Like they absolutely dominated at the polls, and the left-wing kind of cause writ large just marched onwards and left everything in its dust, because we've got like an opposition party, like our version of the Republicans here, which confusingly to Americans is called the Liberal Party, but is really a centre-right classical liberal party.
Sure.
Not nominally on the package, very, very rarely in action. And that's kind of like what's led to this complete, collapse, is essentially they just were campaigning on a strategy of, being Diet Coke to the left's Coke, essentially. So it just became like a Coke. If we're drinking Coke, why would I drink Diet Coke? But like, so as a participant in that election, and like our result here, even with compulsory voting as a Libertarian Party, was like 1.2%. In areas we didn't run like a joint ticket with other parties or whatever. So it's quite demoralizing. And I think that many people who are involved in libertarian politics here in Australia, including myself, as a consequence of that, are starting to think about, well, okay, the political process may not be an avenue through which we're going to be able to express our values or desired world, if not, at least for a very long time. It's not going to be possible. There's a long road ahead to gain any traction in the political process. But, Rothbard, my sort of idol, he always said that involvement in politics is essentially a rearguard action from a libertarian point of view. You're as much running to educate and to build awareness of libertarian ideas and to attempt to block or amend bad laws. So you're sort of like trying to like mitigate the harm of the state. But fundamentally, the cause or the praxis of libertarians shouldn't rely on what government does or doesn't do. Like, there are many things that people can do in their lives, whether it be like the Free State Project in New Hampshire is a good example of that kind of like, they have political goals and they're trying to achieve a political end by getting consolidated, communities of shared value in a geographically consolidated area. But they're also not waiting to do that. They're trying to like build communities and, advance a libertarian life or sphere of influence in a space without politics. And I think that's where I personally have always sort of had that appreciation for as a Rothbardian. But I think now post-election, it's absolutely where my focus is looking at how can we build parallel societies, essentially.
Yeah. Those are cool. I always love it when people do like non-political experiments. Though I was having a debate with another slightly not disillusioned, he's but an even smaller political party leader than yourself, a gentleman who is the chair of the American Transhumanist Party.
I was actually going to ask how that went, because I wasn't able to catch it, and I would love to hear how that went.
It was well, first of all, he comes across as a bit of a Randian libertarian himself. And it wound up being less a debate per se and more of a discussion sort of this guy. He's a really cool guy. But this came up where he's like in a transhumanist political society, people would be doing all these kinds of other things. It's like, well, that's what people imagine. But if your government, which is the arbiter in disputes, has loyalty to certain ideals, then those ideals are going to arbitrate disagreements. And the reason I posed this debate challenge on Instagram, which Coach Josh Wood of Strong for Life Coaching, thank you, Josh, connected us together. The reason I had posted that challenge was not just because I think, well, libertarian has some cool ideas, but it's not correct for really like nerdy philosophical reasons. It was specifically in response to a sort of bodybuilding amateur philosopher named Mike Israetel, who is a bit of a libertarian himself, and was making arguments about immigration, about pornography, and about a few other topics he was very clearly libertarian. And what came up was that libertarianism is not just like incorrect at an anthropological, philosophical level. There is the potential, especially in the age of the internet, but by no means only exclusive that, for libertarianism to do active harm. And I mean, if we accomplished a libertarian society, we would be in a state of increased active harm of a particular kind.
Okay.
So what is that kind, and how does that weigh up against the inherent violence of the state, the taxation and all this stuff, because we can't take these things independently of each other. We were talking about unpacking terms earlier. One of the most important terms to unpack, I think, is freedom. All right, our favorite William Wallace quote. And the normal philosophical way to break this down is there's like a positive freedom, a power to do things.
Yes.
And there's a negative sense of freedom, a freedom from impositions. So you could be out alone and naked in the wilderness. You are maximally free in the second sense and very minimally free in the former sense.
Yes, and libertarians are much more interested in the second sense of
right. But there are psychological dimensions to this that I think, going back to von Mises for a second, praxeology profoundly misunderstands about human nature to our detriment. There is a book. Do I have it handy here? I think I do. The book that essentially broke my libertarianism is this book by Matthew Crawford called The World Beyond Your Head. And in that book, I don't think Matthew Crawford meant it as an attack on libertarianism, but what he describes in the operation of casinos is an understanding of human psychology that is sufficient and powerful enough to manipulate human behavior and to generate addiction. And I think addiction in all humans, because all humans are capable of becoming addicted, breaks praxeology. That's
really interesting assertion, because as we've talked about a little bit in the couple of days leading up to this, that is a big part of my story. So I want to let you finish what you're saying, and then I'd be really interested to reflect on it.
For sure. And like what you have in praxeology, I should clarify this for the audience first, is the argument that all voluntary human exchanges are good by definition. Now, we don't get to say good, we get to say their preferences, basically. Because we don't get to speak on their behalf.
The wording Mises actually uses is that they're rational and that they're directed towards a goal or a purpose, which is a little bit different to good. And I think it's an important distinction. And especially Rothbard's expansion of praxeology goes, explicitly addresses that, which is interesting.
Yeah. But you have to, so rational makes it even weaker, I think, because you have to adopt an extraordinarily acrobatic sense of the word rational to look at the heroin addict buying more heroin and saying that is rational. It can be rational in the most meaninglessly technical senses of the term, in the sense that they are pursuing a goal, and this is, related to the goal of becoming high. But it is so divorced from any vision of what a good human life looks like, and it is necessarily divorced from that.
Yes, that's exactly what he was pushing back against, which was the historicism and empiricism of pre-Austrian school.
Right. That it destroys the possibility of a cohesive society, because we're united by a sense of what the good life looks like. And that's interestingly what's so fascinating with beginning the question I described earlier, like what would you do if you got everything you wanted? Many people on the right and left agree in that ideal. Many people in the Western world have actually very, very similar ideas of how they would like to live. They just have very different ideas of, first of all, what it would take to get there, and two, who's standing in their way, right? And there's all these political narratives of, oh, you could get what you wanted if it weren't for those evil Republicans or those freaking WEF Democrats or the Jews or
Israelis or the Jews. Yeah, exactly, 100%. Yeah, it's pretty
whoever.
spicy.
Right. So, like what libertarianism and the argument, the understanding of human nature that praxeology necessarily requires. And Ayn Rand sort of does this too with her, man is a rational animal, therefore like we build up the rational parts. It's like, well,
yeah, it's objective.
We are rational, but we're not only rational, and there's a lot more. And it turns out what rationality is actually it is nothing more than internal consistency with a given set of axioms. Rationality cannot give you those axioms. Those have to come from a supra-rational vision of what the good life looks like. It has to come from myth or religion, which is why I think the moral arguments about self-ownership and so forth struggle without Christianity, because it's basically from Christianity that we get the Kantian idea of human dignity, of the intrinsic value of human life, and which I think is actually a very dubious idea. Personally.
Yeah, and Rothbard thought so too. So this is where I think the rubber really hits the road, and I'm really keen to like unpack some of this and into it a bit, because I think it is a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. So the danger that I was trying to point out with libertarianism that Mike Israetel, I think, was sort of falling into was words that I adopted from a propertarian political philosopher named Kurt Doolittle. I don't know if he created these words, but he's the first person I heard use them. And those are vice traps and bait into hazard. Bait into hazard would be like predatory loan shark people who give like super high, that they tempt you into things that are bad, and then you can voluntarily accept that, and praxeologically that's fine when people get talked into buying things that hurt them in the long run. And vice traps are things like casinos comes to mind, basically all or most psychoactive drugs. And I say this as someone who has drank probably more than I should. I've been kind of sober-ish for the last couple months. I kind of come in and out. I have a cigarette probably every week or two,
So you're not a teetotaler. You're someone who indulges a little bit. But
yeah, sure. I don't necessarily want tobacco to be illegal, but I think society would be better if we weren't advertising it. Yeah, I think it would. Do I think it would be better if there weren't like OnlyFans billboards plastered up in Las Vegas? Yes, actually. It makes me feel weird driving my kids around in that kind of place. And it doesn't make it doesn't bring men closer to like an ideal state of being. And you can talk about this with garbage food. With pornography is probably the most ubiquitous vice trap, and it's the one that's probably got the most men. And it's sort of hard to talk about because it's like, well, it's in one sense, it's kind of not hurting anybody. And there's people who focus on the sex trafficking and stuff. You could very easily imagine a world where that's not an issue. But to imagine Mike Israetel, when he was being asked about this, says, well, if it's hurting your relationship, you should just watch less porn. Well, that's kind of the problem. You telling an addict, well, just stop it. Just stop being addicted. It's like you're not getting what addiction is. And now that's not to say that there aren't ways of beating addiction that utilize the experience of empowerment and the feeling of choice and willpower. Yeah. That can be a useful tool. I think in general, the results of that tool are a little bit mixed, and it's contingent on a lot of externalities like social connections and things like that. It also varies a lot from person to person. But the idea of living in a society where our commons are free to be filled with bait into hazard and vice traps of this kind, which, I mean, the internet is full of, and the government.
So this is interesting because before we because I think we will go more into commons. Because you've said a lot of stuff, and I'm really keen. I'm like,
sure,
noting away things I want to respond to. without wanting to interrupt you, but like,
no, go ahead.
It's really interesting because like when you said, yeah, that's okay. So when you were like, oh, I want to talk about the commons, it never occurred to me that you might want to talk about the internet as commons, which like to me, it's just like, that's just so alien as a way of thinking about the internet. And that's fascinating. Like that's something I'm really interested to return to as well. I suppose bridging from what you were just talking about. So like many people watching this, if they're watching from my audience or followers or whatever, will know that a couple of weeks ago, I basically was 10 years clean and sober, so abstinent completely from alcohol and drugs. Prior to that, I had, sort of a 10-year unhealthy relationship with both first alcohol and then drugs, which ultimately, culminated in growing criminal record. And then eventually I did prison time for a combination of drug-related offences and some offending related to the small business I had. But that was fundamentally about addiction as well. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so I it's not some abstract thing for me to consider or think about or listen to those arguments you're making and to sort of know the power and danger of addiction and of human psychology around that. It was really interesting. About probably, I think it was the first year after I got out of prison, I had my, no, it was the year after, because I was turning 31, and it was at a like birthday party I had at my mum and dad's place, and it was like a small party with friends and stuff. Some friends that I'd met since getting out, and some that I'd known beforehand. And one of my oldest friends, Hannah, a newer friend that I'd met who didn't know me before when I was in active addiction, said, like, just in small circle, just standing around talking, and he's just like, oh geez, I just really can't imagine Jordan, ever being involved in that or interested in, or behaving like in addiction. And Hannah, my oldest friend, who I've known since like year 9, she goes, Jordan's pretty much stayed the same person. It's just his priorities have changed. And I thought that was like a really beautiful and correct summary, because the same things that were disordered for me in addiction are some of the greatest strengths I have now in terms of like tenacity, stubbornness, ability to hyper-focus on things, boundless energy for things I find interesting, all those kinds of things. And like, you don't meet a lot of people who have really struggled with active addiction and come out the other side who are silly people. Like, it's often a byproduct of, I think, too much empathy and too much sense of connectedness or awareness of like the world's problems. It's actually like a hypersensitivity, hyper empathy problem a lot of the time, because if you're generally someone whose world is small and doesn't pay attention to a lot of what goes on around them, you typically don't take on the world's troubles, and you don't feel like that kind of meta sense of existential anxiety or despair that often fuels an unhealthy relationship with drugs and alcohol, because it's often like a numbing pursuit. And so, yeah, and I also had like undiagnosed ADHD, and I was kind of like self-medicating in the way I was using as well. So that was all wrapped up in there. But yeah, like, I think that when even just Mises, like taking his praxeology like at face value, it's true to say that the way he conceives of rational action, as in action, like, you're right, he means it in a way that may feel useless, but it's an important distinction, because he's not, again, it's important to know what he's not trying to do. He's not trying to predict the future. Like, praxeology makes no claim at all to be predictive. And he kind of like, he intentionally avoids that. Like, he doesn't want to be trying to predict an instance of what will happen. He's trying to set the rules of the game, not what happens in any given game. Like, that's the best way I can explain it to people who might be watching, who might not have kind of reckoned with it too much. It's like, he's much more interested in what are the properties of the system. It's almost like an engineering mindset approach to economics, but fundamentally more than that, human nature and interaction. And he says that the opposite problem to what you identify is that a theory or system it breaks when it attempts to describe what a given person will do. It's very good at explaining and describing consequences in hindsight. Like, as in, if something happens, it's pretty much always able to be explained in the sense
he's essentially trying to do a Rawlsian maneuver. Are you familiar with John
Yeah.
Rawls and the
Yeah,
veil
yeah,
of
yeah.
ignorance? He's trying to say, well, I'm not going to say what is or is not a just society, but against the problem of bias in determining which societies are just or not, here I'm going to lay out the rules of how we would decide what a just society is.
Yes,
and that's going to be the veil of
exactly,
ignorance.
exactly. Like it's almost like a baton race where he's like, I'm just going to run this part of the race, and then I'm going to hand the baton to other people to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's kind of like he pretty much, that's his exercise, because he was doing that in response to the historical empiricist kind of ideas around economics at the time, where people were trying to use study of economics to like scientifically predict the future. And his problem with that, he had this idea called Verstfrei, which was like value free. Like he wanted praxeology not to be a judgment, like explicitly. He's like, it's value neutral.
That's the problem with it.
Yeah, and I can see that's what you take issue with. I actually also find baseline Miesian praxeology dissatisfying for that reason, and that's why I'm a Rothbardian, because Rothbard was kind of like a peer / admirer of Mises, but he, like much younger peer, obviously, but like he wanted praxeology, like he wanted to use praxeology as a bridge into natural law justifications for property rights, which is very much like that moral / philosophical grounds we talked about at the start, because he is much more interested in, okay, what is, exactly as you say, like what is the nature of man? And that's like any philosopher who has like Aristotelian sort of groundings, that man has a type. As humans, we have like a telos or purpose, like we have a thing that we do, and essentially for him that's the fulfillment of purpose through reason, like knowing ourselves, knowing what is good in life. And for Aristotle that was virtue and rational behavior and reason. And basically from that he kind of almost logically deduces rights in the natural law sense as flowing from the nature of man. So he basically makes background context assumptions and value judgments, and then kind of sets praxeology in motion against that background, I guess. Yeah. Whereas for core praxeology, the only a priori like self-evident truth is that man is a creature of action driven by purpose, and they don't really make a priori claims after that. Like everything that flows after that in Miesian sort of ideology is pretty much conceded to be empirical, flowing from that a priori. Like Mises even conceded that. But
this is where we get into some anthropological and psychological weeds. I haven't looked this up. I am assuming that praxeology derives its name from the Greek word praxis, which is the putting of theory into practice. It's not just any action. It is, I have an idea, and then I'm going to manifest that idea into the world.
Yes.
And so to define voluntary exchanges as praxis by dint of them being action is sort of to misunderstand what praxis means. And the fact that we have this word that is praxis, sort of by its nature implies that there's all kinds of human action, contra perhaps Mises' title, which is not praxis, which is not theoretical. It's we're going to try something, or we're going to act from instinct. And man is a reasoning animal, but we're not only a reasoning animal. We're perhaps not even primarily a reasoning animal. And perhaps there might even be some danger, some hubris in reasoning too much, or overestimating what reason can do. If reasoning is, in fact, what I say it is, which is the internal consistency within a given set of axioms. You have to put some extraordinary faith in the certainty of your axioms, which proceed from something other than reason. This is sort of, to put it in mathematical terms, this is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. A mathematical system cannot prove its own first principles. That it's a little bit more complex than that, but rationality.
Rothbard like explicitly rejects use of like mathematical like language or models, I guess, to describe praxeology, because he kind of like he resists that idea. Like it's really funny because like I think Rothbard probably, I get the sense, like I don't know exactly what his experience was, but I get the sense that he probably moved through the same sense of dissatisfaction that you and I have both experienced. But whereas your response to that dissatisfaction was rejection of libertarianism as a holistic answer, at least, his and mine have been to go, okay, so what needs to be true, or what do we need to think about, like flowing from praxeology to make it make sense as a set of ideas to guide action in real life.
So he's got like a theory that's looking for a solid foundation.
Maybe. I mean, I think that he takes, because he's coming at it not from a like Kantian point of view. He is basically coming at it from a natural law, like dimensions of like rights can be discerned through deductive logic and reasoning, essentially, in Rothbard's conception of rights and ethics. So he's got a great book, which I'd recommend. It's a really, really interesting read, The Ethics of Liberty.
Okay.
And he really goes through and kind of talks about how he arrives at justifications for natural rights. And it's very confronting. Like, it's quite a take no prisoners ideology. Rothbardianism, like anarcho-capitalism, is very like, it's essentially an extremist ideology. Like, I'll concede that. It's not like sort of, you can kind of agree and kind of disagree and take it or leave it. It's like, you know, you're all in or you're nothing. And it's like very, like, it's very harsh in its lack of exceptions. And maybe it's because I'm someone who is drawn to extremes that I find his arguments so compelling. And over time, like, I, like you, sort of was on a spectrum where I was like, you know, I would have thought of myself during like the Second Iraq War.
That actually sounds very Kantian. It sounds very deontological, because Kant is very sharp in his deontological ethics as well. Like, lying is never acceptable.
Yes.
No matter what the consequences are. He's an anti-consequentialist, essentially.
Yes.
So Rothbard actually does sound very Kantian in spirit, even if he's not necessarily using a Kantian argument per se.
That's right. It's very, like, he's a very uncompromising thinker. And my political journey from, I would describe myself as like probably a, you know, conservative / I was like that neocon manifest destiny. I was probably that Francis Fukuyama end of history thing early in the Second Iraq War. And then when WikiLeaks collateral murder sort of happened and came to visibility, I was like, oh shit, like the state is acting not like someone who is trying to protect us. It's acting like somebody who's embarrassed and doesn't want us to know what it's doing. You know what I mean? And then so I sort of went along that journey into like classical liberalism and then libertarian. And then now I would call myself an anarcho-capitalist. So it was like, for me, it was a progressive shedding of exceptions. And like, Rothbard basically, unlike Mises, he kind of makes arguments about what is good, like, you know, what we should do with the canvas that praxeology and libertarian ideals give us. So I guess, that's the kind of, that's like the things that have furnished answers to sustain my commitment to libertarian ideas have gone through that journey of dissatisfaction with kind of like core libertarianism, I guess, and kind of like progressed through that to Rothbardian thought. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic. The other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to talk about a little bit was, I think where we finished, which was that kind of thing of like vice traps and so forth. And like, I think that, so I should, before I address that, I want to like sort of understand what. So you believe that there is a justification or a role for the state in regulating or offsetting those externalities or things you would say are like flawed in terms of pure market theory. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. And obviously there needs to be limits on the state, because the history of corruption and abuse in the state is long and storied, to put it mildly. But I mean, what you have, first of all, there is a list of human universals that are true in every human society across all history. Male, female, gender differences, religious ritual. There are some things that happen in every single society, and the state is one of them. The state is a human universal. Now, we don't need to commit the naturalistic fallacy of saying, well, just because something is doesn't mean it has to be. But the burden, I think, is very strong on someone who would overturn a human universal to show that it is a good thing and that it is possible. And the second one is particularly difficult, but I don't even know the first one is great. And we can point to all the problems of the state, the corruption of the state, the violence, the bad violence, we'll say, because I actually don't think violence is an inherent evil, which is a sort of default assumption that many people hold. But all of these things apply to individuals as well. It's not like the state fundamentally changes the character of people. And there was a section of an essay I wrote in, which one was it? This book here, called Descending Odin's Throne, that talks about the problems that we've arrived at with postmodernism, that are not unique to the leftist postmodernists, but I think apply to the libertarians as well. The distrust of people in power, distrust in the state, is essentially an expression of distrust in people. And that doesn't leave us with a society that is free. It leads us in a society that's ruled over by algorithms and computers, because it's a distrust in individuals.
The thing with libertarian ideas, and in particular like anarcho-capitalist ideas, is it doesn't require you to believe people are particularly good or trustworthy for society to function. In fact,
no, I understand.
By operating on the assumption that they're not, it's kind of like taking that risk at its highest and envisaging an ordering of society where you don't have to like or trust your neighbor to trade with them or to respect their property rights.
So this is one of the things I love about Kurt Doolittle and the propertarian school of thought, because part of this whole debate where it gets really philosophically technical is what delineates property exactly.
Yeah, so property in Rothbard's view, and the view which I subscribe, is the mixing of someone's labor with nature, essentially. Right. So you go out into the forest and cut down a tree, and then you use that as firewood or to make a cabin or whatever it might be, and then that generates the mixing of your labor with nature.
Is that descriptive or prescriptive? Is that how property actually works, or is that how Rothbard thinks property should work?
That's how he thinks it should work. As in, that's his justification for property rights that doesn't require the state, so that preempts the state's granting of property rights through law.
So if I went out and I found 20 acres of land out in no man's land, and I built myself a little cabin, I built myself a little water mill, I built myself a little thing, had my family out there, and then some raiders came in and just took my stuff. that would be wrong.
Yes.
What would I do then though? They've taken it, they kill me, they take my stuff, and they now own it. I did the work, but they kill me and they kill my family or take my family, and now they possess it.
Well, you'd be dead.
They now own that land, don't they?
Yeah, look, I mean, in the absence of, so like, we're talking about here an assumption or a justification for property rights that explicitly recognizes aggression is wrong because you have property. You inherently, by virtue of, like, for example, although this goes a little bit more into argumentarian justifications for property rights, which is what Hopper advocates, that like even by sitting down and having a discussion like this, we're essentially forsaking force. Like, we're acknowledging that each other has rights that are worthy of respect that can't just be simply aggressed upon.
It's sort of a presuppositionalist move. I hear Christians do that in the.
Hopper is interesting. He's like a lot more. He's a lot more so what than Rothbard is. Rothbard like agonizes over these things, but essentially, going back to your comment that violence isn't always wrong, like the idea of the non-aggression principle, and it's interesting because you often hear, going back to what you were saying about the left and like the left and the right kind of agreeing on being concerned about harm. The language of harm, I think, is not necessarily that helpful from a libertarian standpoint, because aggression and harm are very different things. You might do something that might inconvenience or diminish someone else, but that might not be, like, not all harm is aggression.
Well, let me change my scenario then a little bit. Suppose these raiders came in the night while I was asleep, and they didn't hurt me, they didn't hurt my family, they just took my car. Right?
Yes.
Is that violence?
Yes, absolutely.
But they didn't hurt me.
No, but they aggressed against, like.
So we have a somewhat ideologically nuanced definition of violence here, that most people wouldn't be familiar with. And conversely, I mean, when I built my cabin,
and the most kind of, I suppose, iconic formulation of that from a libertarian standpoint is the assertion that tax is theft. Like, that would be kind of quite non-intuitive to a lot of people. And in fact, like in the last couple of days, someone here in Australia made a post on X, and they were saying like, oh, this government no longer represents the people, they're ignoring the will of the people, so therefore we shouldn't pay tax. And I'm like, well actually, that's a very, like, it's actually the nature of the state. Like, yeah.
The line delineating harm from violence gets really hazy in a number of different ways. I mean, if someone comes up and slaps me, that's violence, but it's not harm exactly. If someone comes up and accuses me of being a rapist, or worse, a racist, if you live in the United Kingdom, anyways, like that is not violence, or is it? Can you do harm? Can you do violence with words?
Yeah, I don't think
libel. You would,
and the whole like shouting fire in a crowded theater where there's no fire, like that's like the sort of commonly sort of thrown around limit to free speech. Like,
right? I think libel is the real limit, because that is clear harm, and in some cases it's I don't think it's necessarily incomparable to violence. I don't like calling it violence, because to me violence is hitting someone or shooting them. Like it has this precise meaning. Talking about theft is violence. Talking about I've heard Stefan Molyneux just define fraud as violence. Okay, we can talk about something being bad without blending categories in this very special way. Now, the classic critique of this mixing labor with the land theory of property I heard from another propertarian named Eli was, if you dump a can of tomato soup into the ocean, you don't now own the ocean. You just lost a can of soup, right? So there's weird
that's true. That's true. But then I think
proportionality questions, and I mean, like, what about the trees I had to cut down in order to build my log cabin? Is that violence to the forest? Is that violence to the view that my neighbors had? What gets defined as violence becomes this very, very particular and subjective thing.
Well, it's interesting you use that. Interesting you use that last example, because that's an ongoing source of tension, I feel, even between people who would in many respects call themselves libertarian. That idea that you should be able to exert influence over what someone does in their land. Like, so I'm sure in the US you have this similar thing of like NIMBYism, right? Like where it's like not in my backyard. Have you heard that concept? Yeah. And like you've got a counter movement now rising, the YIMBY, like yes in my backyard movement, which is trying to like upzone and have medium density, all that sort of stuff. I'm quite sympathetic to a lot of those arguments. There's a lot of stuff mixed in with the core property right dimension of YIMBYism, which is basically like sweeteners for leftists to like try to get them to agree. Like the YIMBY movement's pretty much like, yeah, we're basically economic libertarians, but we want to make sure we sweeten the pot so that the Greens and socialists will support our upzoning, you know what I mean? Like windfall tax and stuff like that. But even kind of stepping back from that and saying like, do you have a right to a view? Like, do your property rights extend beyond your property?
Yeah.
I would argue.
Can I give you a fun alternative definition of property that very conveniently answers all this in one go without tortured definitions of violence?
Go for it.
Property is whatever people are willing to fight over.
That's an interesting definition. That's a very interesting definition.
Because even if you homestead, your ability to retain that property is contingent upon your willingness to and your ability to defend it.
Yes.
And so it's in this regard that the state, which is on the one hand a protection racket, but on the other hand actually does protect people, and we don't get a sense of that really, because our states are fairly powerful. We don't have China, breathing down our necks because the government's like, no, these are our tax cattle. We need to. They're ours. You don't get them.
I like that. I like that. A non-virtuous justification for nationalism. Like these are our.
Of course, it's greedy self-interest. Yes, of course. I
love that. And my training and profession now, I'm not working in litigation, but so like at the kind of culmination of my kind of rehabilitation or turnaround, I've completed a postgrad law degree and kind of on the threshold of admission to legal practice and worked in law firms and stuff. And that was a summit to climb, as you can imagine, given what I've told you about my past. But it's really interesting to contend with the idea that if it weren't for the threat of force awaiting at the state's behest for those who violate property rights or whatever else like that, at the end of the day, at the end of every fancy road with nice clothes and kind of beautiful buildings and courtrooms and stuff is someone holding a gun saying, I'm going to shoot you if you don't comply with this. Like that is essentially sort of what you're saying as a justification for violence that can be good or justifiable from the state is the violence that is attendant on enforcement of law.
And we sit on property that we possess because of violence. We acquired by violence, probably from other people who acquired what they had through violence.
There's a really funny comment that's come up just in terms of your definition of property. And it is this that I just saw. And this is great, actually. Not great because of like what it is, but it's just quite an interesting test of that definition. So, so if the definition of property is something that people are prepared to fight over, are women property, because there are many men who would fight over women in modern and historical contexts.
Absolutely. And what's funny too is men aren't the only ones who fight over women. Women will fight over men too.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very true.
Ask me if I mind being thought of as property by a woman. No.
That might go into some very different places to where I expected this conversation to go.
I mean, my wife and I both view marriage as a kind of mutual ownership. You know, it is we have a certain kind of right to each other in terms of our time, in terms of our attention, and you know, other things. And it's not absolute. I mean, we are still our own individuals and stuff. But yes, when you if you sign a contract with a company saying, I will work here, I am your employee for, you know, X wages for X times on these hours on these days, they own your labor during that time. They own a portion of your time. If that is offensive to you, then that's probably because you've adopted an ideological view of what ownership is and should mean that is at odds with reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always defined employment as you are selling your labor. You know, I would say it's more akin to a lease, like a temporary grant.
Sure, they don't own you in an absolute sense, and like, but it can happen by
you have sold a claim on your time during those particular hours,
and this can happen by degrees too. And one of my favorite examples. The beautiful thing about this proprietarian definition, again, this is not my original thinking here. This belongs to Kurt Doolittle. The idea of property as what people are willing to fight over is it creates a very expansive notion of all kinds of non-physical objects of property, including commons. There was a funny Instagram reel I saw of a guy saying, you know, if you think back, if you eliminate all the violence and the horror and stuff, most religious wars in history are just a bunch of nerds arguing that that's not canon.
You're right. The Crusades is the pre-internet equivalent of somewhere someone in the world is wrong.
Right. Well, the Crusades were a little different. Maybe like the like War of the Roses and the like the Lutheran rebellions and stuff. But you know, we fight over all kinds of things, or we don't fight over all kinds of things that perhaps we should. An example, and this is not something I think we should fight wars over or anything, but something that might be near and dear to people's hearts. Is the canon of stories a kind of commons? I think it matters to people, and people find solace and enjoyment and a sense of community when they come together around something like The Lord of the Rings, for example. You know,
and they do have quite a vicious like protection reaction when someone tries to,
well, when you see like what Amazon was trying to do with like the Rings of Power series, like that was direct violence against canon. Like that was just violence against the commons. That was someone walking into your public pool, dropping their pants and taking a big dump in your pool and saying, here, pay us money to watch me do this, basically.
But yeah, I think that kind of does tangentially highlight an issue with that definition of property, which is that it kind of creates a scenario where someone can create something. So someone can author something or build something. And then by your definition of property, others can acquire rights or proprietary interest over that creation without actually contributing anything to it, just by virtue of caring about it. And I think that's kind of, I see that's a big problem within our society today, where people almost feel that they have ownership of things that fundamentally they don't, like whether that be whether that be the view of the neighbor, or whether that be
but a big part of that, right, and a big part of that comes down to the feeling of ownership. And again, some people will take offense to this, say, well, you don't own the Lord of the Rings, so who are you to say Amazon doesn't get to do this or whatever? But so my favorite works, the books that are closest to my heart are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, right? And there are people who try all kinds of things with Homer. Arguably the most ambitious and perhaps greatest work of literature in the 20th century was James Joyce's Ulysses. an unbelievably ambitious work that basically inverted the Odyssey. Instead of a guy being gone for 20 years, it's a day in the life. The guy just wandering around for one day. Instead of being gone for 20 years and his wife remains faithful, he's gone for one day and he's trying not to come home instead of trying to come home, and his wife is already preparing to be unfaithful. It's all of the Odyssey points inverted. But it is a serious work. I don't like it personally, but it is Joyce taking the Odyssey seriously in a sense. I don't know if he was doing it necessarily any favors, but it's okay. I can work with this.
So you feel differently about something that is a well-intentioned attempt to have a new take on something that treats the subject with respect.
Yes, people who feel a sense of ownership treat it differently than someone who uses the object in question, the commons, as an object to be cashed in on. It's one of the works I like to make fun of and attack the most often. I would do violence physically against the work if I could. Is Emily Wilson's translation of Homer, because she hates the work. She dislikes the characters.
So this is that whole thing of like the phenomenon of the comic book writers who come in and they hate the character and they subvert expectations and whatever. It's like
yes. It's like if you don't feel a positive possessive a feeling of ownership that leads to a sense of stewardship, you should not have this sense of the right to do this. And there was this big argument that was happening several years ago in Germany when there was an incident in front of a cathedral where about 100 women were sexually assaulted by migrants. And a bunch of German men said, we need to protect our women from this crazy attack. And a bunch of feminists came out of the woodwork saying, what do you mean your women? And like the sense of possessiveness is obviously a little different than the ownership meaning of a slave, right? They don't think they own these women in that sense. But there is a sense of possessiveness, as in like our population, my fellow citizens, are a part of the commons that I live in, that I have some kind of duty to, that I'm a part of this as well.
As you're talking, I've just had this word pop into my mind that I think might almost be a better description of the phenomenon you're seeking to describe than property, and it is investment. That's just the word that kind of swam into my mind as you were talking, that I think like I can get around that idea that if you are invested in something and you care about it and you feel connected to it, that is a phenomenon. But I don't think that phenomenon or property rights is necessarily served well by expanding what property is or should be. And like, if we think about the commons in some of the more traditional realms of the commons, like you mentioned the internet and pornography and things like that earlier, but like, the example of like poaching in Africa, it's, the commons, the tragedy of the commons is that poaching exists and these beautiful wild animals in parts of Africa are hunted near to extinction, for their horns, for the, fertility, virility sort of properties purported, or scarcity in Asia, whatever. And that then becomes a justification for the increasing intervention of the state to have rangers, protect the animals or whatever. But the Rothbardian argument to how to best save these animals would be to allow them to be essentially bred and farmed for that purpose. Like,
sure.
As in that essentially, like you have salmon farms, right? Like, that it's like, oh, we're not going to go and depopulate wild salmon population. We're going to have these, farm traps or whatever that farm salmon, and that's going to be what we harvest salmon.
That issue is acutely near and dear to the heart of many Americans right now, as of about a month ago, because there was a component of Trump's, big beautiful bill that was being pushed by a certain senator named Mike Lee, that was proposing to sell off millions of acres of public land. And what was extraordinary was how quickly both the left and the right came together in opposition to this. Said, you are absolutely not selling off our public land. Because it turns out, it's not just land that we, hike and hunt and stuff. You could say, well, private companies could open up, hiking trails. Private companies could buy up the land and sell access to hunt this land or whatever, or we'll just open up a bunch of elk farms and we'll farm elk. It's like, well, part of what we value about these spaces is not just there's a certain je ne sais quoi. There's a quality to wilderness that is valuable apart from the things that we can extract from it. That is a non-material thing. And this is what commons are like too. There's a feeling of togetherness that is not quantifiable, that doesn't fit into economic calculations, but which is at the core of what people want in life and in their connections with other people. That I'll throw another libertarian in. If you go back a few years ago, Stefan Molyneux made a trip to Poland, and he saw a Polish national parade, a bunch of people waving flags and stuff. And it was so fascinating watching Stefan Molyneux actually crying, watching this and saying, I didn't understand nationalism before. I didn't understand what I had been missing. I didn't understand this feeling of togetherness and being part of something together with other people that is not possible in libertarianism, but which actually does exist and which has been taken away from us. And this is actually the big point of the Crawford book I brought up earlier.
If we can just
talks about it.
Sure. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but just because I don't want to miss that, because that's something that I really wanted to unpack a little bit. When you said it's not possible in libertarianism, I think those were the words you used. Mm-hmm. That's not true, I don't think. It's because in the federal election campaign, the way actually it's interesting, you probably can't see the full banners and stuff, but this was the kind of messaging or branding of libertarianism we talked about, where it was like the fundamental building block of libertarianism is not necessarily the atomized individual. Mises absolutely conceives of people that way, but the Rothbardian view, or the more realistic view, is that absent the state, it's actually necessary. It's impossible for the atomized individual to survive. The atomized individual is a historical anachronism. You can't look at history and see a point where people weren't in groups or tribes or whatever. And what we say as libertarians is not that the state should be replaced by every man being a state unto themselves or an island. It's that what would replace the state would be, voluntary associations, charitable organizations, sporting clubs, churches, communities, all these sorts of things. Those are the natural building blocks of human society. And it's not that libertarianism doesn't have anything to say about those things, but those things fill that gap that I was talking about, where libertarianism doesn't try to create the detailed populated Sims roadmap of what the world without the state would be. It's simply
they talk about organizations that are basically like the state, but are technically not the state because they don't operate with.
They don't operate off a monopoly of force.
Right, so and that's their weakness.
It's not the things the state does libertarians inherently object to, because we acknowledge that in a world without the state that functioned, there would be, whether through spontaneous emergence or whatever, there would be entities that would largely replicate many of the functions of the state. So it's not what the state does per se that libertarians take issue with. It's the voluntary nature of engagement with those alternative structures, the competition that enables, and the lack of coercion, or the absence of coercion.
Right. So you mentioned a brief while before, we don't need to expand our definition of property in order to get to these places. The reason I was attracted to the proprietarian definition of property is not because I think it's so much more expansive and it's changing in a neat and nuanced way. It's because I think it's more descriptive. Like historically, it's amoral in a way. Without violence, you don't get property.
Yeah.
You can say, well, it's the
Libertarians also don't.
initiation of force. It's not reactionary violence is fine, and that gets
Yeah.
into that question about what constitutes initiation. But
Yeah.
I'll just throw out there, we have it's a little bit outdated because it's been a while since we've seen this, but we have a glimpse of what that world looks like. By that I mean a world where there is property enforced by violence, but in the absence of a state.
Yes.
And it goes back to about 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, where you had very weak city-states, and people protected what they owned and what they claimed to own, and it was a world that was dominated by blood feuds. Now, blood feuds were pretty bad. They were the singular object of woe and complaints by the elders in those societies. And the problem was you had no objective method for arbitrating disputes. I have heard some libertarians talk about what a sort of third-party private arbiter might look like. And you get
arbitration is my perhaps unsurprisingly my area of specialty.
However it begins, that winds up being a state. Now, there is a question you can throw out there of like, well, if these arbitration companies that enforce rules by violence, which they have to do, get large enough, like, is that a state? Well, it can be like medieval Iceland, where you can join whatever king you want, and it still winds up being a state, one way or another.
Yes and no, because I think that one important dimension of imagining a stateless society or private solutions to what the state currently provides. Firstly, I would agree with your characterization that non-state entities. So there's this is not philosophical, this is not economic, this is not even really political. There's a guy called David Kilcullen who is an Australian former army officer who actually he helped Petraeus and McChrystal develop America's counterinsurgency doctrine in the Middle East. And he went on to propound a theory of envisaging theaters of military operation by understanding the way in which various non-state actors compete with the state in different arenas of life. So military, economic. So he's got this great, it's called a theory of competitive control. And funnily enough, so I read 3 books in very quick succession in prison, which is a very unlikely environment to read all 3 of these books. I told you about 2 of them. So I read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations on Stoicism and so forth. I read Rothbard's For a New Liberty, which is like his manifesto. And then I read this book by David Kilcullen, which is called Out of the Mountains, The Coming of Age of the Urban Guerrilla. Now, I have no idea what the prison censors were actually thinking when they like looked at these 3 books as they came in and thought, oh yeah, we're good with this, whatever. I suspect I probably benefited from either the lack of understanding or disinterest by prison censors over a number of years to get those 3 books in quick succession. But his theory of competitive control essentially envisages economic, societal, and military arenas in which non-nation state actors vie with the dominant nation state in their area, and ultimately, if they are successful enough in 1 or even 2 of these domains, can actually supplant the previous nation state. So he actually conceptualizes the state as simply the most successful warlord band that has kind of gained the trappings of legitimacy. He doesn't really appreciate the political implications and philosophical implications of what he's observing in this theory. But I was like reading it going, I can't disagree. Like he's essentially saying there's nothing special or moral or distinct about the state. The state is simply a band of raiders, to use your earlier description, who have become entrenched enough in power and kind of have the trappings of legitimacy and the broad acceptance, or at least begrudging acceptance of like the majority of the population. to have essentially claimed the mantle of statehood, which is almost like this apotheosis, like, sort of, fruit of the gods, ambrosia, sort of like, okay, we are now the state. It's like we were something else, but now we're the state, and we were always the state, comrade.
That goes all the way back to St. Augustine. St. Augustine said, what is the difference between, a bunch of bandits and a state, other than the acceptance of its neighbors?
Yeah, other than custom. Yeah, custom and broad acceptance of reign. And Machiavelli said a very similar thing,
right. And what you're describing goes back to the definition of violence that we were talking about before. Is stealing someone's car violence? Is duping them using fraud violence of some kind? Maybe the trickier question is manufactured consent violence. If we just turn the dials of people's psychology and prime them to accept something in large enough numbers that we can get them all on board, is that violence? It might be something that's serious enough to use violence back against, but that gets you into a legitimacy trap, right?
Can you throw Tim's most recent comment up, Rob, as well? Yeah, sorry, continue, but I want to touch on this in a second.
Yeah, a great society was built by people wandering into the wilderness, claiming and propagating land. Yes, claiming it from somebody.
Yeah,
right.
Well,
there were people there.
Yeah, the reason I like that
there.
Exactly, and that's actually what I was going to talk about too. Is like,
and by the way, when the Indians got there, the land was also occupied. So it's not like the Indians didn't take it from someone else before too.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And that's kind of what I was going to say. Is like that kind of scenario you said of like, oh, what if I go out onto the fringes or out into the wilderness and this kind of terrible thing happens and like raiders take my stuff? It's like that is the essence of because the example I thought of when you were talking about like where have there been examples of property rights existing independently of the state, I actually thought of Deadwood in the American Western frontier. It's a fantastic series. If you're watching this and you haven't watched HBO's Deadwood, it's an amazing television series as well. But like it was essentially a settlement built outside of and theoretically independent from the United States of America on Indian land in the Black Hills in what was then Dakota, I think, or North Dakota. I think it's now Montana is like where it's actually landed. And yeah, essentially like they operated a society and a town, like a community settlement in which fundamentally the world looked very similar, albeit much more prone to violence. It was where Wild Bill Hickok met his end famously, playing poker. You'd be subject to like claim jumping and stuff. If you found a good gold claim that proved out, you had to be very careful who you told about it because people might just decide to knock you over the head and take your claim, kind of thing. But even looking at a much more modern example of society functioning outside the state, a really interesting example, like you touched on when we were talking about commons, you talked about like advertising or cigarettes being legal, and that I'm really glad you mentioned that because that was one of the examples I wanted to use of government policy functionally creating an area of society or interaction, whether it be the market or society, and I'd argue the market and the society are fundamentally the same thing. But in Australia, we have such significant restrictions on legal tobacco. So we have warnings on cigarette packets. So cigarette companies aren't allowed to actually use their proprietary markings. Like you can't get Marlboros or Winfields or whatever. You can get them, but they're covered with pictures of people with like throat cancer and foot gangrene and all this sort of stuff.
Oh, that's annoying. Yeah.
It is deeply annoying. And it's totally ineffective for the reasons I'll explain in a moment. They've even got now mandatory writing on the filters of cigarettes. No joke. You've bought the packet of cigarettes, you've opened the box of cigarettes, and on the filter is written a message. And let me tell you what the message is, because it's glorious and totally unself-aware. It's, how much is this really costing you? And that's coupled with insanely high tobacco excise to the point where there is a flourishing, like Volstead Act level prohibition black market of tobacco in Australia, where like organized crime gangs from the Middle East basically sell like illegal chop because the taxes have become so high on cigarettes in Australia that it's a de facto prohibition. And so it's created this flourishing black market with all of the things that were attendant on the Volstead Act and prohibition. Like Australia is wild because you've got like, yeah, like if you walk down the street, so I live in a city called Geelong, which is like just south of the capital of Victoria. You can walk down the street of like suburbs in Geelong, and they've got like A-frames on the street saying cheap smokes here, and it's like openly advertising illegal tobacco. And every so often the cops will like raid somewhere, and then they just pop back up like a couple of days. It's like, it's just totally, it's the state has basically, through, by virtue of its policy settings, it's ceded control over this incredibly lucrative market. Like initially the forecast for the previous financial year that the election took place in was like, they expected to bring in 15 billion of tobacco excise, and they had to revise it down to 12 billion in the mid-year financial estimates. And then by the time it came close to the end of the financial year, they're like, actually, we only brought in 9 billion, even though they'd like jacked up the tax rates so high. So basically, I guess what I'm saying, or what I'm getting at, is within zones, whether it be through, you know, extremely high taxation and de facto prohibition, or whether in the case of illicit drugs, which is also a world I was involved in. So in addition to addiction, I was like trafficking more or less to sustain my own habit, but kind of like, you know, at a level enough that I was kind of interacting in that world.
Like the CIA.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I'll pay that. That's great. Exactly. That's right. Yeah, I was just dabbling. I was just a tourist. I was like, you know, but because I was moving in those worlds, it's like those worlds have norms that don't emanate from the state. They often feature violence, but in large part, the rules of the market hold, and people transact in much the same way as they would.
Well, so I feel like a great example of seeing this in action is the Mexican cartels on the border territories, where like the New Generation Cartel and the Zetas are like vying for space. Unbelievably violent. Heads are showing up in newspaper bins. People are getting, you know, shot and skinned alive and stuff. It's terrible. Where one cartel holds territory, some of the most secure places in Mexico. Most of the American tourist areas in Mexico are controlled by cartels. There was one story from a few years ago. An American woman got raped by a couple of Mexican men. The cartels tracked down those two men and skinned them alive. Said, you are not going to hurt our cash cows here. They will be safe here.
And that's exactly what Kilcullen basically argues, is like, if non-state actors, and the cartels would be that in this example, can sufficiently provide a better you know, system of justice, or you know, consequence for transgressions in the favelas, or you know, all that sort of thing, the barrios.
But it's interesting to call the cartels non-state actors, because the only thing that makes them not a state is the fact that they are not officially legally recognized as such. Yes. They are, and they don't effectively project a monopoly of force. They're a great source of force. I
go further than that and say that they often intentionally stop at that line, because for them to assert monopoly of force would demand a reaction from the normal state.
But in those areas where they have maintained safe areas for their tourists, they have de facto monopoly of force.
Yes,
which is why no one challenges them there, and tourists can go in there safely. So the monopoly of force there is the absence of a vacuum. It's the vacuum of power that seems to create violence historically.
I think it's a vacuum of order, not always. Like, I would say, and you're right, the burden lies on me to prove, and I think that work is best done in my most recent thinking, and there'll be people watching this who are sort of like interested to sort of see where I've landed and what my goals and priorities are post-election, who followed my campaign and stuff. And like, where I've landed is that the best way to prove that concept is almost in small localized communities of shared value, where you can actually say, okay, it's not going to be possible for us to go out and find an area of wilderness that's unclaimed and set up a libertarian society and prove it that way or whatever.
Yeah.
The better way to view it is that a group of libertarian aligned people in a geographically discrete community could essentially pay the protection money to the state, the notional legitimate state, to essentially buy themselves the freedom to build an alternative parallel society in a small area.
Well, this sort of brings me back to my introductory political question. We don't live in a libertarian society, either in Australia or in the United States.
Yes.
Can you do that?
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is,
I think we can.
Yeah, I think we can too. And I agree. I think that I often find a lot of people are like, oh, if Force X, and Force X in many cases for libertarians is the government. Like, oh, if the government didn't exist, I'd be happier. It's like, well, maybe not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's my call to action to people. And I actually love that that's something we seem to agree on, is like, I think that the vast majority of what people turn to politics for and are trying to achieve with appropriate redefinition of scope, like what often people are actually saying is they want all of society to be a certain way or agree with them or whatever. If you redefine that to say, what does my family believe and do? What does my community, my sort of sphere directly, what does that look like? That can be, with very few exceptions, very libertarian. Like, you can homeschool, you can like all these things. And I agree. And I think
a lot of the leftist hippies want to agree with this. Have you seen the movie Captain Fantastic by any chance, by Viggo Mortensen?
No.
It's a very good movie, very leftist. They celebrate Noam Chomsky and stuff, but it's kind of a libertarian dream. It's like this family that's living out in the woods. Their kids they've raised to be like super knowledgeable, incredible athletes. They like know all these different plants in the woods. They know history very well. It's like it may be a bit of a fantasy, and it does a good job of bringing up some problems with that too. But it's and of course there's a right-wing version of that. There's an agreement on what is ideal, what kind of life do we want to live. And I think to sort of bring it back to the question here is like, what is libertarianism in reference to that dream? I think a lot of people get into libertarianism thinking libertarianism is the dream. But what libertarianism is in its theoretical underpinnings is a proposed path to get from where we are to that dream.
Exactly.
So then the question is, empirically, does libertarian theory, whether you take the economic arguments, the moral arguments, or the philosophical arguments, does it actually move us in that direction? Because all three of those things, economic, moral, and philosophical, begin with an assumption that humans are rational animals, that we are defined by our rationality, and that our rationality is king. And I think on all 3 points,
we're defined by our reason, which is different to rationality. But like, I agree, and I think that's the real crux of like where,
right? So like, I think we have a reasoning capacity, but we are neither defined by our reason, nor is reason the most powerful element in our minds by nature. And we have to struggle in order to rein in, like Plato's charioteers, our spirit and our appetites. And in a society where we have we give license for vice traps and baits into hazard, you're going to allow a great many people not just to not achieve that dream of the ideal life, but to allow them to be taken off the path from that by people who are scientifically practiced in the art of taking people off that path.
Yes.
And that's, I think, not only does libertarian theory not get us closer to that dream, but it runs cover for the people who would do those vice traps, the casino owners in Matthew Crawford's book.
Another way,
and so forth.
another way of putting it, though, I think, because I concede that that struggle exists and that not everyone will, in a libertarian world where libertarian theory was writ large, not everyone would, within that framework, get to that endpoint. But the real question is or are the, and this kind of goes back to your initial conception of like the premise of the debate, or of wanting to like have the argument. It's like, are the problems and the issues that libertarianism does identify correctly and gives much greater weight to in terms of the harms done by the state or the potential for harm by the state, does that outweigh the acceptance of the capacity for people to stray from the path, to use your terminology? I would say, and I think anyone who practices libertarian philosophy or politics has to say that yes, the risks posed by free will writ large in a society where there are predatory people are outweighed by the risks posed by the state because of the state's unique capacity to do harm. So I think that's the way to, and I think we're sort of coming to the end of the time we have, but like that for me is the way to square the circle, is to say that if you are more worried about the kinds of risks you identify in terms of the ability for people to choose in whatever quality of choice or consent or reason you might say exists, would you question the quality of that to a large extent? But the dignity of risk or the ability of people to make wrong choices is, to a libertarian mind, far outweighed by the certain harm that state monopoly of force will invariably produce. So I think it's like risk for, like potential risk versus certain known harm or certain known detriment. That's the, like, it's like, do you believe that the state can be made less harmful such that the benefits the state provides in those areas of risk you've identified are ameliorated? Or would you agree with that as a general kind of like?
I understand what you're getting at, and I don't know if the state can be made less harmful. I mean, my assumption is the primary operating mechanism of the state is corruption. Like many people see like this, like corruption as a oh, these people are doing backroom deals and rubbing each other's backs, and that's like a breaking from traditions. Like no, that's actually the primary mechanism by which power happens. That's how power is acquired, is you make deals with the keys to power that give you access to these positions.
And that's even more emphasized by successful revolutions of the past have always been revolutions of the middle class aspiring elites. It's never truly the common man. It's always the people who are at the gate. If it was
the common man, he would be wanting to do the same thing. So there is a danger to power, but like, you can't. I do think, going back to what we were talking about before with blood feuds and gangs and so forth, you can't only compare the state, which is the monopoly of force and therefore the personification of force in society. So you say, well, force is evil and hurts people, and the state is force, therefore the state is evil. It feels like a very solid axiom. But like you were saying, if we're comparing things, to have property without the state is to live in a state of perpetual violence. There's a wonderful documentary from 1963, I believe, called Dead Birds. It's a guy in an island in Southeast Asia, it might be Borneo, who's sort of living amongst some primitive people and watching their sort of blood feud. Someone gets killed, so they have to go off and raid the other side and kill someone else. And there's great honor to be made in killing members of the other tribe. But as soon as you kill a member of the other tribe, they will come and try to kill you too. And I think that is
much closer to home examples in the Middle East that are playing it right now that we definitely don't need
right.
to
go into. And that is the state of existence. And you don't need the state for that violence to be there, because the violence of the state reflects the capacity for violence in individuals. Humans are incredibly tricky, incredibly powerful little pack predators. You know, we're not quite as muscular as a tiger. We're not quite as formidable or resilient as like a bear. But we can run really long distances, and we can throw things really well. Now we can shoot. And we can communicate really well. I think those three things really define us far more than our reason. And we, you know, the power of the state is only an amalgamation of the violent capacity of human beings that comprise the state.
I think the state is more than the sum of its parts. Like you know, there are a lot of libertarians who are like, oh, people in the machine aren't really like, you know.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to say fair. I didn't mean to be you know, simplistic in that regard. But what I was trying to say is that in a stateless state, we have violence as well. Violence is not unique to the state. Is my point.
No. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And I think it is worth saying, like it is worth saying that like a common critique made, particularly of like libertarian foreign policy, for example, is that it's like, oh, libertarianism is pacifism, or you're calling for like enforced neutrality or isolationism or whatever. It's like, no, that's not true. Like libertarian philosophy acknowledges that there are instances in which violence can be not coercive aggression, in the sense, if this is
very Augustinian, defensive.
Defensive violence of your property rights or of your neighbor's property rights, etc., or like banding together to collectively defend your property rights. Like collectivism and freedom of association is not like the perfect.
But the non-aggression principle gets, again, and we already talked about this a little bit, but like if I bamboozle you into signing a fairly predatory contract, and I get like you know, like, and you try to get out of it in some way later, and I say, no, you're stuck in this contract. At some point in the escalating process of me trying to trap you into a predatory contract and you trying to get out of it, one of us can define the other's actions as violence. Just as me, someone coming in taking my car, although they do no harm to me, can be called violence because they're trying to take my property without consent or proper purchasing, whatever. And then we just get into a sort of silly semantic argument about what constitutes violence.
But I don't think so, because with the example you just gave about like trying to bamboozle somebody into a contract, fundamentally the contract is something that's consented to, and in a world where you didn't have certainty in the state's preparedness to enforce a contract, and where you didn't have the often ubiquitous assumption that there will be consumer protection legislation in place that will prevent somebody from doing this to you, or that you'll have recourse if you make a silly decision. Like essentially all of this kind of presupposes a playing field where you have the state there in some capacity. Like in a world without the state, people's incentives and calculus would
your family comes over and breaks my kneecaps.
Yeah, like well, it would just be alien. If you were in a world, like if we woke up tomorrow, and I often used to like make this joke when I was in prison, like a lot of guys in prison, if there was like a zombie apocalypse and you woke up one morning and all the jailers were gone and didn't come to work, there would be a big percentage of people that would stay in this, like they would do their routine, like the cows getting milked and stuff. Like there would be a big proportion of people who would just like go, oh, well, I've got 6 months to go and then I'll let myself out. Like there would, I guarantee you, having been in that environment, there are a lot of human beings who would be like, oh, well, I'm supposed to be here for another 6 months. That's where I'm going to stay. But like the existence of the state itself distorts calculus and action and consequence.
And that's the purpose.
Well,
the purpose is to distort.
It is
to deter blood feuds.
But my point is, it also fundamentally changes the way people think about risk and the way people, if you knew, like, so the question you posed a couple of times throughout this discussion was like, if there was no state and you had the ideal world, what would it be, or what would it look like? Another question that I think is a great question to ask is, if you knew that there was no safety net and that your actions would have whatever consequences they had, how would you act that would be different to how you act today? Like what would you give greater thought to, or like it's that whole thing of caveat emptor, of reputation, of like
Right.
society would order itself in a similar but importantly distinct way from the way it does now. That's I think what I would say.
If we were to assume, one of my wife's favorite TV show lines is, there's a woman, there was a baking show, and they were trying to cook some Italian version of macaroni and cheese, and a woman tastes it and she says, man, if this had just a little bit of meat in it, it would be like a carbonara. And the Italian guy just looks at her just baffled. He's like, this is nothing like carbonara. If this had meat, it'd be a carbonara. Yes, and if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. You know?
Yeah.
and everyone like rolls on the floor laughing. If humans were to decide everything rationally, is a little bit like saying, well, like, what if we were not people? What kind of society would we make if we were not people? My favorite political book has become Plato's Republic, which is a very misunderstood book. Karl Popper wrote an entire a collection of books, really, on the assumption that Plato was being literal and advocating a sort of fascist, communist, utopian macro
Plato's
state.
critics probably would have agreed. They're like, yes, that one's you.
Well, I mean, and amusingly enough, Plato closes the book with this story of the myth of air, where this guy descends into the underworlds and sees people choosing their own lives. And there's a character in the underworld who was raised in the just city. He only did good things. He was raised perfectly. He made good decisions because everything in the city was arranged for him to choose the correct thing. And so now he arrives in the underworld, and he's only done everything good by habit, not out of understanding. And so in his future life, he chooses the life of a tyrant and completely screws up his own life. So like the goal is to not like decide everyone's life for them. Is to if
allow people to
right.
Understand through.
If we have a shared vision of what the good life is, and that's a really, really big and important asterisk. We have to have a shared vision of what the good life looks like, at least in broad strokes. Then we can construct a society together that helps us on this journey towards that good life, or at least towards a sort of harmonious coexistence. But if we the worst thing for Plato, the most unjust and the most to be pitied man, is the tyrant, the man who is a slave to his own emotions and worse, to his appetites. He's enslaved to the libido dominendi, the lust for power, which is like a sexual desire, basically. He can't stop it. And very amusingly, the first conversation in the Republic is with Cephalus, this old man who's being asked, can you still get it up, basically, in your old age? And the old man says, I'm very happy to be free of this demon, which sounds like a sexual conversation, but it's actually a political conversation. He's freed from the lust for power. It's very clever priming for what the subject is actually about in the Republic.
That's a story and a sentiment I think we can finish on that I think will be infuriating.
Right.
About.
Well, I what the question is, what keeps us from being free? What leads us to the feeling of freedom? And I feel like what libertarianism and leftists as well, and sometimes right-wingers too, often focus on is it's those people over there that are keeping us from being free. It's the state that's keeping us from being free. It's the evil Republicans. It's the Jews. It's white heteropatriarchal normativity or whatever that's keeping us from being free. And that is it's very politically expedient. It's very politically powerful because it gives you a Schmittian, sort of Carl Schmittian outgroup that creates the concept of the political and an organizing principle for a political party to acquire power. But the greater threats to our experience of freedom in life are more internal, according to Plato. And
I agree.
insofar as we can work together to make our commons a place that doesn't tempt us into these libidinous traps of addiction, whether that's video games, whether that's gambling, whether that's certain kinds of drugs or whatever. And again, we don't even need to make it illegal necessarily, because most of these drugs have legitimate purposes. Even fentanyl is useful in some cases for anesthesia. So I think the skill with which, especially smartphones, are used to trap people and to take away our freedom using our own bodies as our captors is not only the greater threat in the age of the internet, but maybe if we go back 2,300 years, maybe that's always been the greater threat. And so libertarianism at a theoretical level, with its focus on the assumption of rationality rather than rationality as a goal to be clawed towards and acquired after great effort, poses some dangers to individual freedom that I think we've overlooked.
Well, I think that, we could easily go back and forth for another 2 hours. I wanted to thank everyone. Thank you for making the time zone coordination possible purposefully.
And you as well. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who's watching either now live or later in recording, either in parts of this or in whole. And I think the premise that we should take more responsibility for the things that make us happy or the things we want to see in our own lives and in society. And, I absolutely support your working towards a better vision of the commons with the consent of those you can persuade of it, rather than at the barrel of state gunpoint. But it was great to meet you, my friend. And I feel like I've learned a lot from the conversation, and hopefully everyone at home has benefited from it as well. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me, and good luck to your future endeavors in law and politics. You're an excellent man and a pleasure to chat with.
Thanks, mate.